The rain fell in sheets on the captured, pockmarked runway the Marines called Henderson Field. It was August 20th, 1942. The 1st Marine Division, isolated on Guadalcanal, was being systematically strangled. Every night, Japanese warships, the dreaded Tokyo Express, bombarded their perilous perimeter. Every day, enemy bombers droned overhead. Their tenuous supply line from Espiritu Santo, 800 miles away, was constantly severed. In Tokyo, war planners pointed to maps where Guadalcanal was a lonely, doomed pinprick, an exercise in logistical inevitability. American supply lines, they calculated, would collapse under the sheer weight of distance and imperial might. Then, through the tropical mist, came an unfamiliar, ragged roar. 19 gull-winged F-4F Wildcat fighters and 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, their U.S. Marine Corps insignia stark against the olive drab, bounced onto the muddy steel matting. Led by Major John L. Smith, this ragged band was the first installment of what would become legend, the Cactus Air Force. Against every Japanese staff prediction, these pilots and planes did not wither. They became the island's shield and its spear. In the first desperate months, from this swampy, shell-cratered base, they would fly over 1,200 combat sorties. The Imperial High Command believed in a cold arithmetic of tonnage and nautical miles. The men of Cactus rewrote the equation with courage, cunning, and an uncanny ability to fight with whatever was at hand. But how did a handful of pilots, living in foxholes, flying patched-up planes on a diet of Japanese rice and determination, defy one of the world's most powerful air forces and irrevocably change the course of the Pacific War? Japan's strategic blueprint for the southern resource area was a masterpiece of geographic arrogance, built on a single formidable hub, Rabaul. Captured in January 1942, this massive base on New Britain became an impregnable fortress, the anchor of a vast logistical network. From its multiple airfields, squadrons of Mitsubishi G4M, Betty bombers and Agile A6M0 fighters could strike any Allied position in the Solomon Islands with near impunity. Their supply lines, stretching back to the captured Dutch East Indies and the home islands, were secure and short. As outlined in their own war monographs, this gave Imperial headquarters a profound sense of tactical permanence. Any American counterthrust, they reasoned, would wither against this centralized wall of air and steel. This confidence was rooted in the doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle. Japanese planners, especially in the Imperial Navy, were psychologically conditioned to expect and crave a massive, conventional American fleet sailing into their web. They would then pounce and annihilate it in a classic war-ending engagement. A ragged brigade of U.S. Marines digging in on some godforsaken jungle island did not fit this grand narrative. It was a nuisance, not a battle. Their playbook had no chapter on a stubborn, small-scale lodgment sustained by a trickle of air power. Their assessment of Allied capabilities bolstered this contempt. The veteran pilots of the Japanese Naval Air Force, blooded over China, considered themselves masters of the sky. The Zero's phenomenal range and maneuverability had dominated the early Pacific Air War, making early American F-4F Wildcats and P-39 Airacobras seem sluggish by comparison. The very idea that the Marines could operate an airfield under the guns of Rabaul was ludicrous. Any such strip would be pulverized by nightly naval bombardment and daily precision bombing runs, a textbook application of superior force. As Japanese staff officers in Rabaul confidently scheduled the next bomber sortie to finish off Henderson Field on Guadalcanal itself, the Americans were doing something the Japanese playbook didn't account for. They were improvising. The first Cactus Air Force pilots weren't just flying. They were learning to fight and survive on a shoestring. Henderson Field was not an air base. It was the airstrip at the end of the world, and arguably the worst place on Earth to fight a major air war. The runway was a fragile ribbon of perforated steel matting laid over crushed coral and mud, constantly shattered by Japanese bombs and naval shells. There were no protective revetments. Mechanics worked in the open, battling tropical downpours to perform miracles with minimal tools. Pilots lived in waterlogged foxholes along the festering perimeter, ravaged by malaria, dysentery, and constant hunger, surviving on captured Japanese rice and occasional wormy biscuits. The logistical pipeline was a recurring nightmare. spare parts, .50 caliber ammunition, and precious 100-octane aviation fuel arrived sporadically via desperate night runs by solitary, slow-moving cargo ships. When these failed, Douglas R-4D transports risked everything to land with drums of fuel. Ground crews became masters of cannibalization, creating Frankenstein planes from multiple wrecks to keep a handful airborne. Pilots flew until they were killed, shot down, or collapsed from exhaustion. The threat was omnidirectional and relentless. By night, lone Japanese bombers, nicknamed washing machine Charlies for their irregular engine beat, dropped fragmentation bombs to shatter sleep. By day, formations of Betty bombers, shielded by swarms of Zeros, pressed home attacks. From the sea, naval gunfire could erupt without warning. The airfield was under permanent siege. The stakes were absolute. If the Cactus Air Force failed, the Marines below would be stripped of air cover. Japanese reinforcements would flood ashore unimpeded. Guadalcanal would fall, and with it, the entire Allied strategic foothold in the South Pacific would crumble. They were not just defending a muddy strip. They were holding the thin, jagged line between containment and collapse. Out of this chaos, a unique fighting doctrine was born. It wasn't taught in any manual. It was dictated by survival. Declassified tactical notes from Cactus pilots reveal simple rules. Take off before dawn, get altitude fast, use the sun, hit the bombers first, never, ever dogfight a Zero on its terms. Facing annihilation, the Cactus Air Force forged a brutal, ingenious doctrine of survival: scramble and thump. Every tactic was born from stark necessity. It began with the dawn patrol. Knowing the Japanese bombers from Rabaul were creatures of habit, pilots would be in their cockpits before first light, engines coughing to life in the pre-dawn gloom. They clawed for altitude, knowing it was their only currency. The island's lone SCR-270 radar, the Guadalcanal radar, provided a pathetically thin margin, often just 15 minutes. The wail of the condition-red siren meant scrambling into a sky already seething with enemy aircraft. Their core innovation was a ruthless prioritization. Kill the bombers. The Mitsubishi Bettys and Nakajima Nels were the real threat, carrying the bombs that could crater Henderson Field into oblivion. To break them, pilots perfected and adapted the Thatch Weave, a defensive scissors maneuver invented by Navy Lieutenant Commander John Thatch. Flying in two plane sections, Wildcats would cross in front of each other, each covering his wingman's tail, turning their inferior turning fighters into a mutual killing zone for any pursuing Zero. They used slashing, high-speed attacks from above, pouring .50 caliber fire into the bombers' unarmored fuel tanks, often igniting catastrophic fires. The directive was clear: ignore the escorting Zeros unless absolutely necessary. Let them chase, you kill the payload. Every airframe was forced into multi-role desperation. The same SBD Dauntless dive bombers that hunted Japanese destroyers on the slot by night flew perilously low-close air support missions for embattled Marines during the day. Wildcat pilots, after tangling with Zeros, would drop down to strafe Japanese infantry concentrations with their machine guns. There were no dedicated missions. There was only the perpetual crisis of the moment. This forged a cult of the personality, where individual skill became a strategic asset. Aces like Major John L. Smith, Captain Joe Foss, and Major Marion Carl became legendary. Their aggressive tactics and mounting victory tallies, verified by gun camera film and multiple witnesses, provided an irreplaceable force multiplier for morale. When Marines in their foxholes saw a Wildcat with a growing row of sun flags on its fuselage streak overhead, they knew the sky wasn't entirely owned by the enemy. These men weren't just pilots. They were the embodiment of a defiant will, proving that ingenuity could offset material lack. The doctrine was tested daily. The Squadron War Diaries from September and October 1942 read like a continuous, brutal ledger of loss and victory. And as the tallies grew, the Cactus Air Force achieved something the Japanese thought impossible: local air superiority, one desperate dogfight at a time. The day began in a hole. A pilot woke to the shudder of distant naval gunfire or the receding drone of a washing machine Charlie. He crawled from his muddy dugout, pulled on a sweat-soaked flight suit, and shuffled to the mess for a breakfast of cold canned beans and bitter chicory coffee. The walk to the flight line in the damp pre-dawn darkness was a gauntlet past the skeletal wrecks of planes not worth cannibalizing. The briefing was brutally simple. Radar's clear for now. They'll come with the sun. Get altitude. Kill the bombers. Then the wait. It never took long. The sudden, ear-splitting wail of the condition-red siren shattered the morning. Pilots sprinted for their fighters. Crew chiefs, already at the ready, had engines coughing to life. Within 60 seconds, the first Wildcat was rolling, bouncing over shell holes on the steel matting, clawing for the sky. Others followed in a frantic, staggered stream, forming two plane sections as they climbed, their eyes straining into the brightening eastern sky. Then the call. Tally-ho! 10 o'clock high! The distant formation materialized. The ominous, steady V of Betty bombers, sunlight glinting off their canopies, with the nimble, weaving specks of Zero escorts hovering above. The leader's voice crackled. Hit the bombers! Ignore the fighters! A collective push forward on the sticks, a screaming dive, the world compressing into a narrow tunnel of wind, gun sight, and the growing silhouette of an enemy bomber. Tracers lanced past. G-forces slammed bodies into seats. A burst of .50 caliber fire, a flash, a plume of black smoke, then the violent breakaway searching for the next target. Landing was another trial, dodging fresh craters on the strip. They counted missing planes over lukewarm coffee during debrief. If their aircraft was patched and fueled, the cycle reset. Maybe a low-level strafing run over Japanese positions along the Matanico River, or a patrol over the slot, watching for the next Tokyo Express. Then they'd do it all again that afternoon. This was a day. This was every day. This grueling pace generated the staggering sortie count. But the true measure of the Cactus Air Force's impact wasn't in the hours flown. It was in the specific moments where their intervention changed the battle on land and sea. October 1942 was the crucible. The Japanese High Command, infuriated by the stubborn American lodgment, launched a massive, synchronized offensive to obliterate it. It was the ultimate test for the Cactus Air Force. On the ground, the 17th Army hurled regiments in furious nighttime banzai charges against the Marine perimeter in the battle for Henderson Field. At sea, a powerful bombardment group including battleships sailed to reduce the airfield to rubble. The entire Allied position hinged on the ragged flyers of Cactus. They became a fire brigade, rushing from crisis to crisis. As Japanese infantry massed in the jungle, SBD Dauntless dive bombers and Army P-39 Airacobras, flying perilously low through ground fire, answered frantic calls from Marine forward observers. They dropped fragmentation bombs and strafed with .50 caliber guns, breaking up attacks before they could gain momentum. In the daylight, the sky belonged to American ordnance. Simultaneously, they turned the waters of the slot into a graveyard for the Tokyo Express. Dive bombers and the newly arrived TBF Avenger torpedo bombers relentlessly pounced on Japanese reinforcement convoys. On October 15th, they savaged a critical troop transport run. This interdiction campaign strangled the Japanese ground offensive, sinking supplies and starving the attacking troops of ammunition, heavy weapons, and food. When the Imperial Navy's powerful carrier task force approached to support the offensive, culminating in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the Cactus Air Force projected power far beyond its muddy base. Land-based B-17s and Navy PBY Catalinas, operating from Henderson, located the enemy fleet. While the carrier battle raged, these land-based attacks harried the Japanese forces, demonstrating that no ship was safe within their reach. It was during this desperate month that the sortie count skyrocketed, surpassing 1,200. Each sortie was not a statistic but a targeted intervention. A bombing run that scattered an infantry assault, a strafing pass that destroyed a landing barge, a desperate defense against a formation of Bettys. Japanese after-action reports from this period reveal profound frustration. 111th Air Fleet analysis lamented, "No matter the weight of our bombs or shells, enemy aircraft rise from the field the next morning. We cannot suppress it." The failure of the October offensive was decisive. The Marines held the line. The Japanese fleet, battered, withdrew. The backbone of Japan's hope to retake Guadalcanal was broken. The Cactus Air Force, by maintaining a relentless, multi-role defense against a coordinated three-pronged attack, made that failure inevitable. They proved that a determined air force, even operating from the world's worst base, could dictate the terms of a campaign. By November 1942, the tide had turned. The Cactus Air Force, now reinforced and better supplied, began to dominate the skies. In Tokyo, the realization finally dawned. The isolated outpost they had written off was not collapsing. It was winning. And it was winning because a handful of men in a muddy field had flown more missions than anyone thought possible. The Cactus Air Force's stubborn defense culminated in a decisive, irreversible shift, local air superiority. By early 1943, the skies over the slot belonged to American pilots. Reinforced with new squadrons and better aircraft, they made daylight runs of the Tokyo Express a suicidal endeavor. Japanese destroyers and transports were hunted and sunk with devastating consistency. This air dominance forced Japan into a desperate, inefficient paradigm. Only darkness could provide sanctuary. The nightly high-speed dash of destroyers, the so-called rat transportation, could deliver little more than starving men in life jackets. Heavy artillery, vehicles, and bulk supplies could not follow. The Japanese 17th Army on Guadalcanal was slowly bleeding to death, isolated and unsupported. Psychologically, the failure to neutralize Henderson Field became the defining symbol of the entire Guadalcanal ordeal for Japan. Elite veteran air groups, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were systematically gutted over the island. Pilot morale plummeted as they faced an enemy that refused to adhere to their doctrine, an airfield that refused to die, and losses that could not be replaced. The campaign transformed from a swift mop-up into a grinding war of attrition, a contest Japan's logistical system was inherently unequipped to win. The strategic reckoning was unprecedented. For the first time in the war, Imperial General Headquarters was forced to order a strategic withdrawal. The failure to secure the air, and thus the sea, was the central factor in the secret directive for Operation KE, the evacuation of Guadalcanal. In February 1943, in a brilliantly executed but admission of defeat maneuver, Japanese destroyers extracted 10,652 starving soldiers, abandoning the island to the Allies. They had conceded. Post-war interrogations reveal a clear acknowledgement. Japanese staff officers cited the tenacity of the enemy's air power at Henderson as the critical, unexpected variable that overturned all their calculations. The Cactus Air Force had not just defended an airfield. It had invalidated an enemy's strategy. The immediate victory was the salvation of Guadalcanal. But the legacy of the Cactus Air Force was greater than one island. It proved a concept that would define the rest of the Pacific War. The victory at Guadalcanal, forged by the Cactus Air Force, had immediate and profound consequences that reshaped the entire Pacific War. Strategically, it validated a core Allied concept, the airfield seizure. Capturing even a primitive airstrip and defending it with relentless air power could create an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a springboard for further advance. This became the operational blueprint for the entire island-hopping campaign, from the Solomons to the Marianas. Tactically, the crucible of Henderson Field produced a revolution in combat doctrine. The hard-learned lessons of fighting the zero, the imperative for altitude, speed in the dive, coordinated two-plane teamwork, and the lethal effectiveness of the thatch weave, were codified into standard training for all Navy and Marine fighter squadrons. More concretely, the performance demands of the air war directly influenced the final design of the next generation of American fighters. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, with their devastating firepower, armor protection, and superior high-speed performance, were the physical embodiment of the Cactus pilot's wish list. Morally and psychologically, the story was a galvanizing force. The narrative of the Cactus Air Force, outnumbered, undersupplied, living in mud, yet triumphing, became a potent legend. It was featured in newspapers, newsreels, and War Department propaganda, providing a desperately needed narrative of ingenuity and resilience to the American home front and a massive boost to the fighting spirit of Allied forces across the vast Pacific. It proved that the Japanese pilot was not invincible. While the ad hoc Cactus designation was eventually retired, replaced by regular Marine air wings and use-off units as the front moved north, Its improvisational, relentless spirit set the tone. The campaign transformed American air units from defenders into confident, aggressive hunters. Historians now see the Cactus Air Force not as a curious sidebar, but as the vital catalyst that turned the tide in the Pacific, the moment when the Allies stopped losing and started learning how to win. The historical significance of the Cactus Air Force transcends its staggering sortie count. It stands as a timeless case study in asymmetric air power, a demonstration of how tactical innovation, sheer will, and the relentless exploitation of a single critical advantage can defeat a materially superior foe. Operating from their besieged mud patch, they waged a form of aerial guerrilla warfare, leveraging interior lines and desperate ingenuity against the Japanese Empire's vast but rigid logistical network. Within the greatest generation narrative, it embodies the quintessential American underdog story. It is the legend of the resourceful can-do spirit, of mechanics keeping planes flying with baling wire and parts from wrecks, of pilots flying 4 missions a day on empty stomachs, and of the unbreakable bond forged between the riflemen in their foxholes and the flyers overhead who were their only shield. It is a story not of pristine technological dominance, but of triumph through adaptation and grit. For the United States Marine Corps, Guadalcanal cemented an identity. The successful, interdependent defense of the perimeter by ground units and the airmen above validated the core concept of the integrated air-ground team. This experience became the bedrock for the modern Marine Air-Ground Task Force doctrine, where organic air power is not a luxury but a fundamental element of combat. For naval aviation, it proved the decisive strategic value of land-based air in securing maritime objectives, a lesson applied across the Central Pacific. Modern marine aviators still study Cactus. As one F-35B pilot noted, the technology is centuries ahead, but the core lesson is the same. Adapt, improvise, and support the Marine on the ground. That ethos started in the mud of Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force transformed from an ad hoc emergency measure into a permanent legend, a symbol of what determined aviators can achieve when holding the line is the only option. So, what is the ultimate, roaring lesson from this story of mud, malaria, and magnificent defiance? The Cactus Air Force proved a fundamental, documented truth of warfare. Victory is not always about who has the most, but who refuses to yield the last, decisive point. They demonstrated that tenacity, concentrated at a strategic hinge, can overcome staggering material disadvantage. They held the line in the air until America's industrial might could turn the tide across the entire Pacific. Tokyo strategists predicted collapse because they measured only tonnage and nautical miles. They failed to calculate the morale of a pilot sleeping in a rain-soaked hole next to his plane, or the genius of a crew chief keeping it airborne with baling wire and scavenged parts. They waged a war of statistics against an enemy fighting a war of will, and they lost. This story is equally a tribute to the unsung enablers, the mechanics working under flares, the radar operators in their stifling huts, the Seabees patching the runway at dawn, and the Marine infantry who held the perimeter without which there was no airfield. The final proof is in the cold type of the daily report. The Cactus Air Force Operational Summary for November 15, 1942, states with quiet defiance, despite incessant bombing and naval bombardment, fighter and bomber squadrons flew 68 sorties today, destroying 11 enemy aircraft and damaging 4 vessels in the slot. Henderson Field remains operational. This story is logged in the war diaries of MAG-25 and the memoirs of men who lived in foxholes. If you want to discover more incredible true stories of turning desperation into victory in World War II, subscribe. We scramble into the archives every week. Next time, we'll fly an even more improbable mission, the Doolittle Raid. How 16 B-25 bombers, launched from an aircraft carrier, rewrote the book on naval aviation and shocked an empire. History's echo is the sound of a Pratt & Whitney engine coughing to life on a muddy field. Victory doesn't always go to the strongest, but to those who refuse to be grounded.